I thought I knew exactly what kind of man my husband was. I had spent 7 years studying the way he took his coffee, the soft curve of his laugh, the particular warmth in his eyes when he looked at me across a crowded room. 7 years of mornings and arguments and reconciliations and inside jokes and the 1,000 small rituals that make up a shared life. And I believed, with the certainty of someone who has checked and rechecked, that I knew every corner of him. I was wrong in a way that took my breath away and left a bruise that still aches when the weather changes. The night I stood frozen in the hallway outside our kitchen, my hand pressed flat against the cold plaster wall, I heard him say the words that shattered every single thing I thought I understood about my marriage. "See?" he said, his voice thick with a pride so naked it was almost obscene, the tone of someone savoring a story they have been waiting all day to tell. I showed her my fist and she obeyed, ran straight to the bank to withdraw the money. And then I heard his mother laugh. "I need you to understand something before I go any further. Something about what that money meant, not as a number, but as a thing with weight and history and the particular tenderness of a last gift. The $40,000 sitting in our joint savings account was not simply money to me. It was the inheritance my grandmother Margaret had left me the year before she died, transferred into my name through a will written in her careful, slanting handwriting, a document she had spent an afternoon composing in the sunlit dining room of her house while I sat beside her and pretended not to notice that her hands shook. She had said, with the quiet directness that had always been her great gift, that she wanted me to have something that was purely mine. Not mine and someone else's. Not mine when I got around to it. Mine without qualification. She had lived through a marriage that had taken things from her that could not be replaced, and she did not want that history to repeat itself through me. I had promised her, in that dining room with the afternoon light falling warm across the table between us, that I would guard it, that I would be smart, that I would not let anyone take it from me. I had kept that promise for 14 months. And then I stood in a dark hallway and learned that the man I shared a bed with had put his fist in my face and was proud of himself for what that fist had produced. To understand how I arrived at that hallway, how I had gotten myself to a place where I could be standing in the home I had built and hear something that made the whole structure of my life crack from foundation to roof. You have to understand what that life looked like from the outside and how convincing it was. My name is Claire Hartley. I was 34 years old, employed as a senior project manager at a mid-sized architecture firm called Devereux and Holm, living in a pale yellow house on Birchwood Lane in a suburb that was quiet without being boring, the kind of neighborhood where people kept their lawns tended and left casseroles on porches when someone had a hard week. The house had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with good eastern light that came through the window above the sink in long, pale rectangles every morning, a back porch with 2 wooden chairs we had painted blue the summer after we moved in, and a small garden that I kept intermittently, and Daniel pretended not to notice, was mostly weeds by August. It was not a large or impressive house. It was ours. And I had loved it the way you love things that feel genuinely chosen rather than fallen into. Daniel Hartley was my husband, had been for 4 years, had been my person for 7. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the easy physicality of someone who had always been comfortable in his body, and therefore generous with it. Quick with hugs, unself-conscious in a crowd. The kind of man who shook hands firmly and was remembered for it. He coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings at the recreational center 2 miles from the house, and he did it because he genuinely loved it. There was no performance in the way he talked about those kids, no calculation. He made elaborate Sunday breakfasts and had a repertoire of terrible puns that he delivered with such complete sincerity that they stopped being bad and became, against all logic, charming. He remembered which of my colleagues I liked and which ones made me want to drink heavily at noon, and he asked about them by name at the end of the day, with what seemed like genuine interest. He kept my car stocked with the dried mango slices I liked from the Asian grocery on 5th Street, because I always forgot to buy them myself. He called my mother on her birthday the one year I forgot, saved me from the guilt of that, and never mentioned it again. He was, by every measure I knew how to apply, a good man. I had loved him without reservation and without the guarded self-protection that some of my friends had adopted in their marriages, that careful rationing of trust that allows for retreat. I had gone all in. That is the thing about being all in. When you lose everything. His mother Beverly was a different matter, and I had known that from the beginning, in the way you know some things immediately and spend years afterwards trying to argue yourself out of knowing them. Beverly Hartley was 63 years old, a retired school administrator with silver-streaked hair she wore in a rigid bun at the base of her neck, and a wardrobe consisting almost entirely of cardigans in muted earth tones. Taupe, caramel, a gray that was almost brown, that gave her the visual quality of someone who had decided, at some point, to blend into the furniture of every room she entered while simultaneously commanding it. She was the kind of woman who always brought a dish to every gathering, but made sure, in the course of the evening, that you understood exactly how long it had taken to prepare. She gave compliments that arrived wrapped in something else. "You've kept the house very clean," or "that color is quite brave on you," or "I always think it's admirable when women can manage careers and homes at once. So many can't." Delivered with a smile just warm enough to make you feel small and ungrateful if you reacted badly to them, which of course was the entire point. She had never liked me. I no longer say that with any heat. I say it the way you state a fact that has been demonstrated so many times you have simply stopped disputing it, the way you say the sky is blue or the bridge is long. She had performed warmth at our wedding when the performance was public and the audience was large, and she had done it well enough that several of Daniel's relatives had told me afterwards what a lovely relationship I had with his mother, and I had smiled and nodded and said something vague and appreciative. But in the years that followed, the friction between us had grown the way things grow that are not dramatic enough to address directly. Slow, incremental, a vine working its way through the mortar of a brick wall, 1 millimeter at a time, until one morning the wall shifts and you realize the damage was always happening. She asked questions about our finances at dinners and holiday gatherings in ways that didn't quite parse as small talk. She made suggestions about the house, about selling it and moving somewhere with more room or less room or better schools, depending on the conversation, that always seemed to arrive in proximity to oblique mentions of her own financial circumstances. She called Daniel 3 or 4 times a week, and there were moments when I walked into a room where he was on the phone with her, and he lowered his voice before he noticed me standing there, and then raised it again a beat later, deliberately compensating. The particular performance of someone making up for having been caught being quiet. I noticed these things. I filed them in the part of my mind I kept for data I was not yet prepared to analyze, not because I was passive or foolish, but because I was, at that point in my life, still operating from the assumption that the people I loved were operating in good faith. That is not naivety, exactly. It is a kind of bet you make when you decide to build a life with someone. You decide to extend trust not because you have proven it is warranted, but because without it, nothing gets built. I had made that bet. I was about to learn what it cost. The first time I felt something that went beyond discomfort, something that registered in my body before my brain had assembled a coherent argument for it, was a Sunday in early March. We had driven to Beverly's apartment for lunch, a monthly ritual I approached with the internal preparation of someone walking into a difficult negotiation while pretending to attend a pleasant meal. The apartment was in a newer building on the east side of town, small and immaculate in the way that speaks of someone with very little clutter and very many opinions about where things belong. Every surface was arranged with precision. The knickknacks from Beverly's various travels lined up by size on the bookshelf, the magazines fanned on the coffee table, the throw pillows placed at angles that seemed to have been calculated. The apartment always smelled of the same lavender air freshener, and underneath it, faintly, something warm and slightly electrical, like an appliance left on in another room. We had eaten pot roast. Beverly made a very good pot roast, which I had always considered one of the few uncomplicated things about her. And we were sitting in the living room with our coffee when Beverly turned to me with the particular smile, the one I had learned to recognize as her working expression, the one that meant she was about to say something that required careful phrasing. "Claire," she said, setting her cup down on the coaster with deliberate care, "I've been thinking. That money your grandmother left you, you're keeping it somewhere safe, I hope?" I remember the specific sensation of my hands around my cup in that moment. The ceramic warm and smooth and ordinary, the small, ordinary weight of it, as a kind of contrast to the sharpness that moved through me when she spoke. "It's in savings," I said, "with the mortgage fund." She nodded slowly, the kind of nod that communicates that the answer has been received and found insufficient. It's just, you read about these things. Banks failing, rates shifting. Daniel and I were talking, and we thought it might be worth considering some alternatives. I looked at Daniel. He was examining the middle distance somewhere above the coffee table, his expression the careful neutral of someone determined not to be drawn in. "What kind of alternatives?" I asked. But Beverly had already turned the conversation, with practiced smoothness, to a story about a colleague of Daniel's, and the moment dissolved before it had fully formed. I sat with my coffee going cold and thought, she and Daniel were talking. They had already discussed this. He had not mentioned it to me. I filed this too with all the other things I was not yet ready to examine. In the weeks that followed, the financial conversations multiplied in the way that, looking back, is so obvious in its pattern that I cannot believe I did not see it for what it was. Beverly mentioned over dinner at our house in mid-March that her building's roof required significant repair and the homeowners association was dragging its feet. She mentioned in a phone call with Daniel that I overheard fragments of from the kitchen that her car had become unreliable and that she had been looking at options that were, regrettably, outside what she had available right now. She mentioned at a birthday lunch for Daniel's cousin that a friend of hers had invested in a small property venture and had done extraordinarily well. "Not that I'd expect you two to be interested in anything like that, being so careful with things," she added, looking at me with a warmth that was too precisely calibrated to be genuine. Each mention arrived nested inside something else. A good meal, a favor returned, a warm memory shared, so that extracting it and holding it up for inspection would have required making a scene out of what had been deliberately packaged to look like nothing. Daniel, during this period, underwent a change so subtle and so gradual that I am still not entirely sure, even now, when it began. He was not cold. He was not obviously evasive. He was, in fact, almost artificially warm during this time, more attentive than usual, more careful, the way a person is careful around something fragile they are afraid of breaking. But there was a quality to his presence that I had never noticed before, a faint hum of inauthenticity in certain moments that felt like listening to a recording of a familiar song and noticing, for the first time, that the pitch is fractionally off. He hesitated, almost imperceptibly, before certain answers. He volunteered information about his days in a way that was just slightly too detailed, the way people talk when they are preemptively filling in a story they are afraid you might ask about. Once, only once directly, I asked him whether he had been discussing our finances with his mother. He looked at me straight and said without any visible hesitation, "No, why would I?" And I believed him because I needed to and because I had not yet learned the specific architecture of his lying, which was not the lying of flinching and avoidance, but the lying of steadiness, of looking someone in the eyes and giving them the answer that makes the conversation end. The Saturday morning, 6 weeks before everything fell apart, I came downstairs early. Earlier than usual, before 7, because I had woken from a bad dream I could not quite recall and found sleep impossible. The house was quiet in that particular early morning way, all the ambient sounds louder in the absence of conversation. The refrigerator's hum, the click of the radiator, the distant sound of a car on Birchwood Lane. I came around the corner of the staircase and saw Daniel sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, his coffee beside him, the posture of someone deep in something, shoulders slightly forward, chin lowered. He heard my socks on the hardwood and closed the laptop in one smooth, unhurried motion that was so natural, so unconsidered in its appearance, that it almost didn't register as anything at all. Almost. I stood in the kitchen doorway in my robe and looked at him, and he looked at me, and he smiled. The warm, easy smile I had been in love with for 7 years, and asked whether I wanted eggs. I said yes. I went to pour coffee. The morning light was coming pale and cold through the window above the sink, and the coffee smelled dark and slightly bitter, and I stood with my back to him for a moment with both hands around the mug and breathed. I did not turn around and ask what he had been looking at. I told myself, for the last time, that I was projecting, that I was adding things up into a sum that wasn't there. The mango slices were in the bowl on the counter, where he always kept them for me. I ate 3 of them and let the sweetness of it be a reason to believe everything was fine. It was a Wednesday evening in mid-April when I heard it, when the thing I had been refusing to look at directly stepped out of the shadows and stood fully in front of me. I had come home from work 40 minutes late, delayed by a call that ran over and then rain-slicked traffic over the bridge. I was tired in the way that accumulates across weeks of low-level dread, of noticing things and talking yourself out of them, of managing the performance of normalcy, while something beneath it hums with wrongness. I set my bag by the door, took off my coat, and registered, without quite processing it, the tinny quality of a phone on speaker coming from the direction of the kitchen, and underneath it, my husband's voice kept low but not low enough. The kitchen door was not latched. The frame never quite held it shut. And through the gap, as I walked down the hallway, came Daniel's voice rising in a tone I recognized, the particular brightness of someone who has been waiting all day to tell a story. "See?" he was saying, and there was laughter in it, the undisguised satisfaction of someone proud of something specific. I showed her my fist, and she obeyed, ran straight to the bank to withdraw the money. A pause. Then Beverly's voice, compressed by the speaker but unmistakably hers, carrying the warm approval she reserved for Daniel's performances. "Good. You handled it exactly right. She's always been too stubborn. Men need to show strength, or women like that walk all over you." And Daniel laughed, easy, open, completely at home in the conversation. I stood in the hallway with the cold plaster against my palm and understood, in the slow and absolute way of a foundation settling, that this was not new. This was a language they had been speaking together for a long time. The cold that moved through me was not the cold of the rainy evening outside. It began in my chest and spread outward, methodical and complete, and it did not feel like grief. It felt like clarity. I stayed long enough to hear Beverly ask quietly, "And she doesn't suspect anything about the rest?" And Daniel said, in the voice I had trusted for 7 years, "No, she trusts me completely." I walked back to the staircase. I sat on the bottom step in the thin gray light and pressed both hands flat against my thighs and breathed the rest. There was more than a fist and $40,000. There was a plan, coordinated and patient, and my husband had been inside it the entire time, making me coffee in the mornings and asking about my day and smiling the smile I had built my adult life around. I did not confront him that night. My greatest asset in that moment was that he still believed I knew nothing, and I had no intention of spending it cheaply. I composed my face, walked into the kitchen, kissed his cheek, said traffic had been terrible, and made dinner while he talked about his day. I tasted nothing. Behind my eyes, something cold and purposeful was already assembling itself. When he was deeply asleep, I went to his desk in the home office. I did not touch the laptop. I photographed the contents of the folder beneath his charger with my phone, screen brightness at minimum, moving in absolute quiet. Most of it was ordinary, but near the bottom, tucked between two sheets of paper with the deliberate casualness of something placed rather than dropped, was a printed email. The subject line read, "Updated timeline, confirm before Friday." The body referenced an account number I did not recognize, a transfer described as Phase 2, and a signature, B. Hartley, Beverly's maiden name. My hands did not shake. That steadiness frightened me more than trembling would have. The next morning, I called Joanna from my car in the office parking lot, rain still coming down gray against the windshield. Joanna had been my closest friend for 12 years, since graduate school, and she was, by a coincidence I had never appreciated more than in that precise moment, a family law attorney. I told her everything, plainly and completely, from the Sunday lunch in March through the hallway the night before. When I finished, there was a long silence, and then she said very quietly, "Do not move any money. Do not confront anyone. Get me copies of every document you can access without him noticing." I told her I had photographs. "Come to my office today," she said. "Bring your laptop." What Joanna found, sitting with me that afternoon, was worse than what I had imagined on the stairs. The $40,000 had been transferred in 3 separate amounts across 6 days in late March, each one just below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic notification to my phone. The transfers had gone into an account opened 18 months earlier in Daniel's name alone. From there, a portion had moved again, and this was the second twist, the one that made Joanna set down her pen and look at me steadily, into an account in Beverly's name showing payments to a real estate agent and a deposit on a property 40 minutes outside the city. Beverly had been buying a house, with my grandmother's money, under a legal structure that, had it been completed, would have been extraordinarily difficult to untangle. But the third discovery sat heaviest. Joanna had a contact at the county recorder's office, and she called in a favor while I sat in her client chair, looking at my own hands in my lap. The contact called back within the hour. There was a document on file, filed 8 weeks ago before I had noticed anything wrong, bearing my signature. It was a limited power of attorney granting Daniel authority to act on my behalf in financial matters. The signature was mine. The handwriting was mine. I had never signed it. I want to describe what it feels like to be told your own signature has been forged. It is not anger, not at first. It is quieter and stranger. A violation that goes deeper than theft, because it is not only your money but your name, your voice, your legal self that has been counterfeited. Someone had practiced my handwriting until they could replicate it convincingly enough to file with a government office. Someone had sat somewhere with a pen and paper and worked at reproducing me. I sat in Joanna's chair with this knowledge in my chest like a stone, and I understood completely and finally that I had not been careless or naive. I had been targeted, methodically, patiently, with great care. I did not go home that night. Joanna drove me to my father Richard's house. My father, 70 years old and sharper than most people half his age, who had been quietly skeptical of Daniel for reasons he had kept mostly to himself. I told him everything at his kitchen table over the tea he had been making me since I was 12, and when I finished, he sat for a moment looking at the table, and then he said, "What do you need?" Not "I told you so." Not "Are you sure?" What do you need? I told him 2 weeks, a lawyer, and for no one to know I knew. He made up the guest room. The next 11 days were the most controlled performance of my adult life. I went home every morning in time to make coffee before Daniel woke. I went to work. I had lunch with Beverly once, sat across from her at a restaurant table and listened to her talk about a trip she was planning and watched her hands around her water glass and thought about the document bearing my forged name. She smiled at me with absolute warmth and asked how I was sleeping. "Wonderfully," I said. I smiled back. In my car afterwards, I sat 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Each evening, I returned to my father's, where Joanna and I worked through the documentation, built the timeline, and constructed what she called a comprehensive and airtight case. Airtight was what I needed. The confrontation happened on a Saturday, the last Saturday of the month, which was always Beverly's lunch day. I chose it deliberately. I wanted them both in the same room. I wanted no opportunity for one to brief the other before I was finished. I was standing at the kitchen counter when Daniel came in at 11:15, dropping his keys in the bowl, calling out that he'd stopped for pastries. Beverly arrived 20 minutes later in her caramel cardigan, smelling of lavender, carrying her shortbread cookies as if the gesture settled something. We sat. Beverly poured coffee. Daniel opened the pastry box. The morning light came through the window the way it always did. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Then Daniel reached reflexively for the manila folder I had placed at the center of the table, and I said very quietly, "Go ahead, open it." He opened it. I watched his face change, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional stiffening of the jaw, the stillness of someone deciding very rapidly what to do. Beverly had not moved. She was watching Daniel. I was watching both of them. "These are copies," I said. "Joanna has the originals. The bank has been notified. The county recorder's office has been notified. A detective downtown is currently reviewing the forgery documentation." The kitchen was silent except for the refrigerator's hum and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower. "I want to hear you explain the signature," I said to Daniel. He set the folder down. His hands were steady, but he was not looking at me, which was its own kind of answer. Beverly, to her credit, did not perform innocence. She straightened in her chair and said with a composure I found genuinely impressive even then, "Claire, this arrangement was designed to protect all of us. Your money was sitting in an account earning nothing. We were making it work." "You were making it work for yourself," I said, "with a signature I never gave you." Daniel had authority. "Daniel forged a power of attorney," I said. "That's not authority. That's a federal crime." The word federal landed in the room like something dropped from a height. I watched Beverly recalculate behind her eyes, reassessing how serious I was, how prepared. She had expected tears. She had built her entire plan on the assumption that I would absorb the damage quietly, too humiliated, too afraid of the public unraveling of my marriage to push it to its conclusion. She had strategized around the wrong version of me. Daniel finally spoke. He said, and I will remember these words for the rest of my life, "I just wanted to help her. Mom needed the money, and I thought—" "You thought," I said, "that putting your fist in my face and frightening me into withdrawing $40,000 was helping me." The silence that followed was the most complete I have ever heard. Daniel went white, not pale, white, the color of something from which all warmth has been pulled. He had not known I had been in that hallway. He had not known I had heard him laughing, telling his mother about the fist he had used on his wife as if it were a story worth being proud of. He looked at me now with shame so naked it was almost terrible to witness, and underneath the shame, a fear I had never seen from him. I held his gaze and did not look away and felt, moving through me like cold, clean water, the particular freedom of having absolutely nothing left to lose. Beverly left without finishing her coffee. The property transaction was unwound over the following weeks. The real estate agent had been unaware of the funding's origin and cooperated fully. The bank reversed what could be reversed. The forged document was submitted as evidence. The district attorney's office ultimately declined to prosecute in exchange for a full restitution agreement. Every dollar returned, plus legal costs, plus interest at a rate Joanna described with undisguised satisfaction as punitive. Beverly paid it. She had to liquidate a portion of her own savings to do so. Daniel and I did not divorce immediately. What followed was slower and more complicated. A month of silence, then difficult conversations, then a separation while he stayed with a friend. We tried counseling. He explained in session after session how he had told himself he was balancing loyalties, keeping the peace, that it was alone really, that I would understand eventually. I heard all of it. I understood some of it. None of the understanding excused the fist or what the fist had revealed, that under the right pressure, with the right audience, he could become someone who put his hand in his wife's face and then laughed about it to his mother. That is not something you put back the way it was. We filed the papers the following spring. It was civil and handled almost entirely by Joanna. Daniel moved across the city. Beverly moved to another state. The pale yellow house on Birchwood Lane is still mine alone, which is both lonelier and larger than I expected. I planted the back garden properly this year for the first time, with help from a neighbor who knows what she's doing. The porch chairs are still blue. I have a new coffee grinder that fills the kitchen with warmth every morning. On the anniversary of the night I stood in the hallway and heard my husband laugh, I drove to my grandmother's grave with white freesias, the only flowers she ever liked, and sat on the bench beside her marker and told her what had happened. I told her that the money had come back, all of it. I told her that the thing she had most wanted for me, not the money, but the knowledge of my own capacity to stand steady and speak clearly and protect what was mine. That was also back, fully and permanently, the way things are yours once you have truly earned them. I told her I was fine. And for the first time in a very long time, when I said it, I meant every word. On quiet evenings, I sit in one of those blue porch chairs with a glass of wine and watch the fireflies come out over the back garden, and I think sometimes about the woman who used to sit in that same chair and talk herself out of what she was seeing. She was not foolish. She was loving, which is a different thing, and the difference matters. You can recover from being loving. You carry it with you, that recovered version, quieter, more accurate, still capable of trust, but no longer willing to spend it on people who have shown you exactly who they are. My grandmother knew this. She tried to give it to me, wrapped in $40,000 and a carefully written will. In the end, I earned it the harder way. I think she would have understood. I think she would have been, despite everything, proud.